she the heart of the family. When she died, it was just like everything started going down. But I really wish that she could see her kids grow up.
Vanessa laid on the ground with a bullet hole in her chest and blood everywhere. It's a scary scene.
Often when we think about love, there's a happy ever after. But the whole sad situation about this, you have two people who are falling for the exact same person.
There's a lot of contention, just jealousy, anger, a lot of fights. It's an environment where there can be a lot of conflict and chaos.
I think she had been embarrassed. I think she was angry. And she did a terrible, terrible thing.
6th, 2011. It's around 5:20 p.m. when police in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, receive multiple reports of shots fired at the Sunset Village Apartments.
911. Somebody just got shot at Sunset Village. Ma'am? Somebody just got shot at Sunset.
We went back.
911, may I help you?
Back over there. 911, I need you out here. Somebody just got shot.
911. Would y'all please come to his apartment in Sunset? Please, this girl got shot at her chest.
I was the on-call detective. I received a call about a possible shooting victim that was laying at our apartment complex on the ground. Up on my arrival, there was a lot of people out. It was kind of chaotic. And a lot of people were screaming. A lot of people was hollering at the police. I saw a man with the victim and rode on her back and was attempting to give her CPR. She had a single gunshot wound to the back.
Officers check her ID. They find out that she is a 21-year-old named Vanessa Bearden and a mom of 2.
Paramedics arrive on the scene moments later.
Vanessa's unresponsive, but they do find a pulse, so they're hopeful, and first responders are working really hard to save her life and rush her to the hospital.
Vanessa Bearden was born on May 15, 1990. She grew up just outside Pine Bluff on her family's farm.
My grandfather he was a farmer. He made sure that my grandma had all of this property for us. We had horses, geese, chickens. We used to get the chicken eggs.
By all accounts, they were a very loving, tight-knit family. Vanessa and her siblings were raised in the church, and she sang in the choir. In fact, she was the first Black altar girl of that church.
Vanessa, my auntie, she liked to ride horses, go to church. She was really family-oriented. She was respected a lot. Everybody knew that she was a good person.
One of her closest friends growing up was a girl named Kobe. Their families actually knew each other. They went to the same school, and in fact, they had a lot in common.
But Vanessa's idyllic childhood also came with some unique challenges.
She struggled with mental health issues like OCD and ADHD. The family didn't know what to do with that, unfortunately. So Vanessa started doing a lot of research on her own. Even as a kid, she would write reports about it for school. Growing up on a farm, though, may have helped with that a little bit. Being around animals and nature, it can be very grounding. And her father seemed to be especially understanding as well. You know, Vanessa's dad was a down-to-earth country type guy. So, his way of helping was to give her a pocket knife. It was a reminder not to let her OCD get her tied up into knots. If she ever felt it was closing in, he wanted her to cut right through it.
In 2008, when Vanessa was 17 years old, she suffered a series of emotional blows. First, her father died of cancer. Then, her mother was diagnosed with the disease as well.
When Vanessa's father passed away and her mom got diagnosed with cancer, she really stepped up in the family. She helped with her brother and sister, she helped them do homework, as well as her niece, and really tried to keep the family together.
She did everything for us when my mama wasn't there. She basically taught us what we needed to know for school-wise. She was real smart.
Then, Vanessa discovered she was going to have a child of her own.
Now, Vanessa was a teenager when she found out she was pregnant. And it seemed that that boyfriend was not that great of a guy. But you know, Vanessa, she tried to make the relationship work anyway. She dropped out to have the baby, and she got her GED instead. Vanessa moves in with this guy, and after another year, she's pregnant with their second child. But it's very clear he's not cut out to be a husband or a father, so she finally leaves him.
To support her children as a single mother, Vanessa took classes to become a certified nursing assistant. She was inspired by her struggles with mental health to help others with similar issues.
After she got her certificate, Vanessa got a job at a daycare center, so she wanted to pursue a career in child psychology and counsel kids with mental illness so they wouldn't, have to go through what she did. And she kept taking courses at Southeastern Arkansas College.
She was in a helping field where, she was a CNA, she's working towards becoming an RN. So that's part of that field is making sure that people are being safe and being taken care of when they have needs they can't take care of themselves.
By the time she was 21, Vanessa had her hands full, juggling single motherhood, work, and school, as well as a new relationship.
He was really good to her, and that relationship became serious real quick. He even popped a question while they were looking for an apartment in Little Rock. And she was looking for nursing jobs in the new city to start her new life.
By summer 2011, Vanessa seemed to have a promising future ahead of her. But now, she's been shot outside an apartment building, and police want to know why.
She was 21, she had 2 kids. So this was shocking to a lot of people. Being shot in broad daylight, it's a scary scene. Whoever shot Vanessa definitely had a reason behind it, had a motive. It was intentional.
While on the scene, it was very chaotic. There was a lot of witnesses there from the different apartment complexes that was around in the area. So we had to secure the area and calm the scene down so we could figure out what was going on. Miss Vanessa Bearden, she did not live at the complex where she was found. So the question that needed to be answered was, why was she in that area? Was it a boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, a significant other, attempted robbery? Why was she shot?
As doctors struggle to save the life of gunshot victim Vanessa Bearden, detectives with the Pine Bluff Police Department try to figure out exactly what happened.
There were multiple 911 calls coming into dispatch that day. There are reports of a woman being shot.
There are several apartment buildings all nearby, and many of the witnesses are residents who heard the commotion and also the gunshot. But what led up to this moment? They know from experience that time is not on their side. So police need to move quickly before witnesses scatter or decide to stay silent.
I believe in a lot of small communities, especially African-American communities, there's not always a connection between the police and the community. In those communities, most individuals will take care of their own things. So if a problem is occurring, the authorities aren't always called in to settle disputes or things of that nature because there may be a lack of trust that is there.
Investigators start with the man who was giving Vanessa CPR when first responders arrived.
The Good Samaritan, who still has blood on his clothes, actually is the reverend of the church across the street where Vanessa got shot.
He heard some gunshots and then almost immediately heard some females screaming for some help. And he went to the area where they were, and he discovered Vanessa Bearden and discovered that she had been shot. He began to give her first aid.
He says he saw a few girls running from the scene when he got there. He said he also saw a young lady in the breezeway with a gun. He said he didn't recognize her, but he feels confident that he could pick her out of a lineup.
The Reverend also gives police a pocket knife he found in Vanessa's waistband. He has no idea whether she used it during the fight.
Now, it's not uncommon that women carry knives. Sometimes it's for protection, when they're walking by themselves. Maybe some women who aren't comfortable carrying guns have been known to carry knives on them.
Pine Bluff is a bit on the rough areas, I won't lie. It has its nickname coined as Crime Bluff. Yeah. I carry a pocket knife for my protection. I have one in the car. I have one in my purse. It's just because as a female in Pine Bluff, or as a Black female in general, I feel like it's important to just have some type of protection.
So investigators don't find any blood on the knife, so it definitely doesn't look like it's a stabbing. But there is a 9mm shell casing on the ground.
Police take the bullet casing into evidence, but there's little else to go on. They're hoping someone will be able to identify the suspected shooter, whom witnesses describe as a young African-American woman.
The apartments in this complex are really close together, and they're all connected by this breezeway. So when something happens, someone will either hear it or see it. Police are interviewing everyone, and everyone pretty much had the same story.
It all began in the apartment parking lot earlier that day.
They said that the suspect was involved in an argument that escalated into an altercation with 8 females. They said also that they saw someone recording this fight on their phone.
There were people from all over those apartment complexes. There's 4 or 5 apartment complexes that sit right there in that 2 or 3 block area. There were 20, 30, maybe even 40 people there, all of them with cell phones.
The witnesses, however, were not sure what that initial fight was about, but a man broke it up and put the suspect in a car. They drove away, and the crowd dispersed. Now, a few of the other women involved in the fight stayed there, though.
A short while later, the suspect returns and approaches Vanessa and her friend through the apartment breezeway.
And the guy who broke up the fight is no longer with her, and now she's got a gun. She exchanges words with these other women, and it gets very heated. That's when she opens fire.
They hear a gunshot, and they see Vanessa collapse. They then see the shooter go over to Vanessa, stand over her, and then walk away.
Witnesses believe the shooter lives in the apartment complex. Luckily, someone comes forward who can identify her.
While police are still on the scene, a young lady comes up to one of the officers and introduces herself as Colby. She's Vanessa's friend and was also there when everything happened.
She says she knows exactly who the shooter is and why she did it. This was all about revenge.
Police in Pine Bluff, Arkansas are talking to Colby, who says she was with 21-year-old Vanessa Bearden when she was shot. According to Colby, the fight that led to the shooting started before they even got there.
Colby told the officers that she and her friends were there visiting another one of their friends by the name of Alicia.
A while later, Vanessa stopped by the apartment complex. and was hanging out with Colby while waiting for her ride home.
Colby tells police that when she and Vanessa arrived, they started watching an argument that had started in the parking lot, which was between Alicia and another woman, Olivia Moody.
Colby tells the officers that Alicia and Olivia are arguing over a man.
She described how Alicia was now dating a young man that Olivia Moody used to be involved with, and how that caused some friction. And it ended up with Alicia and Olivia Moody getting into a fight.
And instead of being adult about it, they both was out there fighting.
Colby says the fight quickly drew a crowd of people. Some of them even joined in.
It's almost like being on a schoolyard, a playground. When the fight broke out, everybody that was around those apartment complexes came to watch and unfortunately egg it on. Mrs. Moody was just as involved in that provocation and those actions as Alicia was. She was not trying to escape them. She was not trying to get away from them. She was giving as good as she got.
Colby says Vanessa Bearden wasn't involved at first because she was recording the fight on her cell phone. After several minutes, someone finally intervened.
During the fight with Miss Moody, a friend of hers was able to pull her from the fight. Miss Moody, she noticed Miss Bearden recording the fight and proceeded towards her direction.
According to witness accounts, at that point, Olivia broke away from her friend and lunged towards Vanessa until the friend stopped her again.
He finally manages to break up the fight and gets Olivia to leave with him.
Alicia went back to her apartment, but Colby and Vanessa stayed outside a while longer. Colby now wishes they hadn't.
Colby and Vanessa decide to just take a breather, relax, cool off a bit. So they found an area in the complex to just kind of sit and talk.
The suspect drives by as a passenger in a vehicle and rolls down the window and hollers out the window something to the effect of, "I'll see you females later," except she didn't say female.
Colby says Vanessa showed her the knife that her dad gave her. Like she was ready if anything happens. But unfortunately, the knife was more of a security blanket than a weapon. Colby says she felt like Olivia was setting them up, and it turns out she was right.
Apparently, in that time, she went and got a gun and was trying to bait them back to fight.
Colby says she and Vanessa eventually decided to head back through the breezeway. That's when Olivia stepped around the corner.
She is walking towards them. Then she brandishes that firearm at them.
Colby immediately takes off running and hears the gunshots. She thinks Vanessa's right behind her, but she's not.
The bullet hit Vanessa in her back as she was running away, and it came out through her chest, and she just collapsed to the ground.
But if Olivia's disagreement was with Alicia, why did she go after Vanessa?
I remember kind of being shocked that Alicia, the main person that Olivia Moody had the complaint with, was not even there.
Miss Bearden just got drawn into this situation by being a friend.
It could be that Olivia was upset with Vanessa because she was recording the fight. Or maybe she was angry because they were all ganging up on her, and she didn't care who she shot.
When investigators talk to Alicia at her apartment, she verifies Colby's story, but she wasn't there to witness the shooting itself. The other man Colby mentioned is nowhere to be found.
Nobody knew who he really was. Wasn't as if we had a name associated with a person that could go be interviewed immediately after the incident.
The only person detectives haven't spoken to yet is Olivia Moody herself. But before they can do that, they get some terrible news.
Vanessa was rushed to Jefferson Regional Medical Center. And despite the doctor's best efforts, she succumbed to her injuries and she was pronounced dead at the hospital.
With her being gone, it took from us too. She the heart of the family. Her and Vanessa and my mom, like, we lose them, we ain't got no family.
Vanessa's death also means the case has officially become a homicide.
Investigators don't know yet if this woman intended to kill Vanessa, but either way, she's looking at a murder charge.
Arkansas police now have a suspect for the shooting that claimed the life of Vanessa Bearden, 20-year-old Olivia Moody. But a background check suggests Olivia is the opposite of a cold-blooded killer.
Olivia's life was kind of like an inspirational story.
Our mother was a drug addict, and she was actually raised by her grandmother. It was in a not-so-great neighborhood in Chicago, Illinois.
Everybody in the community knew Olivia to be such a kind-hearted person. She always had a smile. She always had a hug. When Olivia was just 8 years old, she got featured in Time magazine seeking out for help for her mother and her addiction. It showed her character even just as a young child. Some of her siblings followed under her mother's footsteps, and Olivia was determined not to follow down that same path. She wanted to succeed in life.
Olivia worked hard in school, believing that education was the best way out of her situation.
Olivia was academically gifted. She was a straight-A student all throughout high school, and even with growing up in a rough high school, she still managed to be excelling.
She got teased for it a lot, but it eventually paid off.
She earns a scholarship to come down to the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff to be able to get into a new environment, to also find a place to basically reset her life and start life over again so she can get away from the upbringing that she came up with.
Olivia decided to major in criminal justice with plans to eventually get her law degree.
Olivia spent her whole life seeing tragedies, seeing trauma just in her own city. She watched her mom go through addiction, watching close family members fall into street violence. These are just some of the things that led her to wanting to become an attorney.
She also was doing intern work with one of the circuit courts here in town. And so people thought a lot of Olivia.
She was on the dean's list. She was very intelligent, had a bright future ahead of her.
While in college, she also started her first serious relationship.
Olivia was somewhat of an oddball in Pine Bluff. She was able to find a boyfriend and find love. She was finally happy. She was really finding her way.
Growing up and maybe not having secure relationships with her parents and finding, someone that she could be in love with and she started to feel safe with and started to maybe establish a family of her own.
Olivia was heartbroken when her boyfriend suddenly broke up with her and started dating Alicia, the young woman from the recent fight.
Olivia was in love with her boyfriend, and when Alicia came and basically stole him, that was very devastating for her and upsetting. Love triangles can be really tricky. It often leads to a lot of drama. There's a lot of contention, just jealousy, anger, a lot of fights. It's an environment where there can be a lot of conflict and chaos.
But was it enough to drive an aspiring lawyer to kill someone?
We went to the apartment where the witnesses told us that she lived, knocked on the door. She opened the door, asked her if she was Olivia Moody. She stated that was her. When we told her we was going to place her on arrest and take her for questioning, she didn't seem like she was upset at that time. She seemed more like she was relieved. I told her I was going to read her rights before I asked any questions. She said she understood that because she was a student at UAPB and she was a criminal justice major. So I read her rights, and what I found interesting was she told me that the correct charge that you would have for me would be second-degree murder.
Just hours after Vanessa Bearden was killed, the primary suspect, Olivia Moody, sits down with investigators to give her side of the story. Olivia insists she didn't mean to kill anyone. She was defending herself against a group of bullies.
Olivia admits that she was upset about her boyfriend and his relationship with Alicia. But according to her, Alicia was the one that wouldn't let it go.
Alicia definitely was cocky about it. She was excited. She wanted to brag. She definitely wanted to rub it in Olivia's face. Constant picking, nagging, to the point where Olivia just had to block her.
To make matters worse, Alicia's apartment was just across the street from Olivia's.
But it was crystal clear that they did not like each other, and a fight was bound to happen when they all live in that small area with all those different complexes.
And on June 26th, the two finally collided.
Olivia decided to go to the corner store down from her apartment complex. There, she was met by Alicia and a group of her friends, and that's when everything started.
The way Olivia tells it, Alicia was the one that jumped her first. Now, they get into it, but guess what? Olivia is tougher than anyone gave her credit for.
Once Olivia seemed to be getting the better of Alicia, her friends jumped in the fight. And basically, well, you know, when it's many on one, the many usually win.
The video taken of the fight shows clearly Olivia was outnumbered. There's hair pulling and arms flying, and it was a chaotic scene for sure.
Olivia was actually knocked over into a ditch, and she assumed the fetal position.
Olivia says she was afraid the group of women was going to kill her until her friend arrived to break up the fight. As he pulls her away, Olivia notices Vanessa recording.
She's already upset that all these women are gaining up on her, but then when she saw someone recording it, that took her to a whole nother level.
But her friend stopped her before the fight could escalate any further.
Put Olivia in his car and took her to one of Olivia's friends' house so that she could feel safe somewhere, because these same girls were already harassing her at her place.
He also gave her the gun to protect herself. Olivia claims that at the time, neither of them expected she would have to use it.
Sometime later, Olivia returns back to the apartment, and the girls who had fought her where Olivia lived were gathered not too far from her apartment.
Olivia says she had her friend drop her off at the back entrance so that she could avoid all of them. But as she walked past the breezeway, she heard one of them shout, "Get her."
Olivia says that's when she saw Vanessa coming towards her and pulled out the gun.
Olivia closed her eyes and shot the gun. And that's when Vanessa was hit.
Miss Moody, in her testimony that she gave, she admitted firing the gun, but she also said that she was really just trying to scare them away.
To detectives, it seems more likely that Olivia shot Vanessa because she was still angry at her for recording the fight.
In the digital age, you know, when something happens and it's recorded, it's there and it never goes away. And anybody can have that, can get a copy of that you never can take that back. So I can imagine Olivia was feeling helpless at that time period, some embarrassment.
She had gone after Vanessa earlier, so it kind of made sense that she would go after her again when Vanessa got back.
Based on the statements gathered so far, police arrest Olivia Moody and take her into custody.
She was charged with murder in the first degree, which is a Class Y felony in the state of Arkansas. Carries with it a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years, up to life imprisonment.
Not everyone believes she's guilty, however. As word of Olivia's arrest begins to spread, many residents rush to support her.
She's a bright, young legal student that's given a lot to the community. A lot of people believed her. And in fact, they saw her as the victim.
Olivia impacted so many people in the community, so much so to when she was arrested, the community got together to raise some money for her to be bonded out. There were fundraisers and fish fries and raffles, all to make sure that she had a good legal team on her side.
But there are just as many supporters for Vanessa Bearden.
They remember Mrs. Bearden's accomplishments in becoming a nurse and the love that everyone said that Mrs. Bearden had for her children.
People in the community also helped raise money for Vanessa's mother because she was left to raise 2 children on her own, all while having terminal cancer.
The town is deeply divided over the case, and prosecutors fear a jury might be as well.
Some felt like it was self-defense. Some felt like it was murder.
On May 12, 2012, Olivia Moody graduates college with a criminal justice degree and a 3.6 GPA. 4 days later, she stands trial for the killing of Vanessa Bearden. The prosecution's case centers around disproving Olivia's claim of self-defense.
Mrs. Moody was just as involved in that provocation and those actions as Alicia was.
The fight has been over for a while before Olivia shoots Vanessa. Her life is not in danger when she comes back with that gun.
We're not talking about a 5-minute reactionary thing that happens here. We're looking at Olivia getting away from the situation, leaving and going away for an hour, and now coming back. Now it's time for retribution from Olivia's perspective.
Olivia Moody. She was trying very clearly to bait those young ladies to come to her on her terms.
Prosecutors argue Olivia used her knowledge of the criminal justice system to lure Vanessa into a situation where she could argue self-defense, ironically helping prove it was a premeditated act. Although Vanessa had a knife on her at the time, her friend Colby testifies that she never used it or threatened Olivia with it.
If the knife had in fact been in her hand, certainly that would be part of the overall circumstances that could have been argued to a jury to produce fear. But in Arkansas, you have to prove that there was no opportunity for Olivia Moody to have avoided the situation or to have retreated from the situation.
Vanessa's injuries also prove that she couldn't have been moving towards Olivia.
She had a single gunshot wound to the back, a back shoulder. She was fleeing from the suspect, and at that point, she was no longer a threat.
Still, with public opinion about Olivia's guilt so evenly divided in the town, prosecutors decide to play it safe.
The prosecution offered to give her a plea bargain. The prosecution offered to reduce the charge against Olivia Moody from first-degree murder to manslaughter, which is a Class D felony, carrying with it a maximum prison sentence of 6 years and or a fine of $10,000. And she declined.
Olivia seems certain that once the jury hears her side of the story, she'll be acquitted.
In the state of Arkansas, when you plead self-defense, we were going to have her testify as to her state of mind.
The jury hears all about Olivia's background, how she's been bullied on social media, and how these women have ganged up on her. They're arguing when she sees Vanessa waiting for her, she thinks it's gonna happen again.
And we're trying to prove that the circumstances were such that a reasonable person in Olivia's position would have been in fear of serious bodily harm or death had the young ladies who were approaching her engaged her in another assault.
But the jury doesn't seem to be convinced.
Olivia came across to jurors as not being remorseful, especially given her obvious intelligence and education. And I don't think it was helped by her performance on the stand.
She was very matter of fact. She was not upset at all. She did not appear to have any remorse or concern for Vanessa Bearden. She was very snobbish, if not arrogant, almost of the attitude of, I've told you it was self-defense, how dare you question me?
It really came down to, does the jury believe that it was reasonable and the only option Mrs. Moody had was to defend herself with deadly force?
On May 18th, 2012, the jury returns a verdict. While they don't think the killing was premeditated, they also don't believe it was self-defense. Instead, they find Olivia Moody guilty of second-degree murder. She receives the maximum sentence.
On May 12th, Olivia received her bachelor's degree in honors. And on May 19th, she received 30 years in prison.
The two women involved are fighting over the same man. And that's not a good reason in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, for somebody to die. And I think that also had something to do with the length of the sentence. In the minds of some jurors, when you talk to them, they had an expectation of someone with Olivia's education, training, and intelligence, that she would make different choices, rightly or wrongly.
Olivia Moody has no one to blame for this but herself. She walked through that breezeway with that gun in her hand. She shot Vanessa Bearden as Vanessa Bearden was unarmed and ran away from her. That is no one's fault but Olivia Moody's.
In 2019, Olivia gets some surprising news.
After serving just 7 years of her sentence, Olivia went in front of the parole board, and she was released on September 27th, 2019, which actually was her 29th birthday.
Shootings and homicides, we deal with them quite frequently. This one was a little different because it wasn't drug-related and it wasn't gang-related. It was just a tragedy. 2 young ladies' lives, one lost, families torn apart. It was a situation I feel like that probably could have been avoided.
Even if Olivia claimed that she was being bullied, Vanessa had actually never met her before that day. Hearing Olivia paint herself as a victim was painful for her family, because Vanessa is the one that's not gonna see her kids grow up.
Revenge, that's all it was. She wanted revenge. She came back to a situation that had already de-escalated, and she killed her cold blood. They didn't know each other. Vanessa, my auntie, she was just there at the wrong time.
I believe that Olivia Moody had been embarrassed earlier that day. I believe that she thought she had set up a scenario where she could get...
The warehouse looked ordinary from the outside, That was the first mistake. There was no fortress wall surrounding it, no armed guards standing beneath floodlights, no sophisticated security system humming behind steel doors, no dramatic alarm waiting to scream the moment someone crossed an invisible line. Just a warehouse in rural Quebec. Inside, however, sat something worth millions. Not gold, not diamonds, not stacks of Canadian banknotes sealed inside vaults. It was maple syrup, thousands upon thousands of metal barrels, each one holding hundreds of pounds of amber liquid, were stacked in rows inside the building. To an ordinary person, they might have looked almost disappointingly mundane. Heavy drums, industrial shelving, concrete floors, the faint smell of wood, metal, and sweet syrup lingering in the air. But to the people who understood the maple syrup business, that warehouse was something else. It was a bank. A very unusual bank. Its money was golden, sticky, and stored in barrels. And sometime in 2011, someone figured out that the bank was almost completely unguarded. The theft would eventually become known as the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist. By the time investigators understood what had happened, millions of pounds of syrup had disappeared. Not a few barrels, not a truckload, millions of pounds. The total value would eventually be placed at more than 18 million Canadian dollars. And perhaps the strangest part was not how much had been stolen. It was how long nobody noticed. For months, trucks could move in and out, barrels could be handled, syrup could be drained away and transported somewhere else. The criminals did not need to smash through walls in the middle of the night. They did not need to hold anyone at gunpoint. They did not need to force open a vault. They simply exploited a system that had been designed to trust the people operating inside it. And then they did something almost absurd. They put water back into the empty barrels. From a distance, the barrels still looked full. The warehouse still appeared to contain its treasure. The numbers on paper still suggested that the syrup was there. But the fortune was slowly leaving the building, one barrel at a time. The people responsible had discovered an extraordinary weakness in the way the reserve was stored and inspected, and they had the patience to exploit it. That patience would ultimately cost them millions. But before anyone was arrested, before police began tracing trucks across provincial borders, before investigators started following the syrup through legitimate businesses and into the United States, there was only a warehouse. A quiet warehouse. A warehouse filled with syrup. And somewhere inside that building was the first clue that something was terribly wrong. It began with weight. In July 2012, Michel Gavreau arrived to take part in an inventory inspection. On paper, this was routine. There was nothing cinematic about an inventory check. No one expected a crime scene. No one expected a national scandal. No one expected that a few moments of lifting, weighing, and examining barrels would expose one of the most unusual thefts in Canadian history. The barrels were where they were supposed to be. The rows looked intact. The warehouse had not been turned upside down. There were no broken locks lying on the floor. No shattered windows. No obvious signs of forced entry. Everything seemed to be in place. That was precisely what made the discovery so unsettling. Gavreau examined the barrels. One of them did not feel right. A barrel that should have been heavy was lighter than expected. At first, that could have been a simple explanation. Perhaps there had been an error in the records. Perhaps a barrel had been partially emptied for some legitimate reason. Perhaps someone had moved syrup somewhere else and forgotten to update the inventory. There are always explanations for small discrepancies. Then another barrel was checked, and another. The problem was no longer one barrel. Something was happening throughout the warehouse. The barrels that were supposed to contain hundreds of pounds of maple syrup were not carrying the weight they should have carried. When the contents were examined, the answer was almost unbelievable. Water. The syrup was gone. In its place was water. Imagine that moment. A worker standing inside a warehouse, looking at a barrel that appears to be part of a vast reserve of maple syrup, only to realize that what should be inside is not there. Then imagine discovering another one, and another. The realization would have spread slowly at first, because the human mind resists conclusions that seem too strange to be true. A mistake is easier to believe than a conspiracy. An accounting error is easier to believe than a multimillion-dollar theft. But eventually the numbers become too large to ignore. The missing syrup was not measured in dozens of pounds. It was measured in millions. Approximately 6 million pounds of maple syrup had disappeared. Thousands of barrels were involved. The warehouse had been quietly emptied from within, and whoever had done it had understood the operation well enough to leave behind something that could fool a casual inspection: water. The discovery transformed an ordinary inventory check into the opening scene of a massive criminal investigation. Suddenly, every barrel became a question. Every truck became a possible clue. Every person who had entered the warehouse became someone investigators might need to speak with. Every inventory record had to be reconsidered, and every assumption about the security of the facility had to be questioned. How could so much syrup disappear? How could thousands of barrels be moved without someone noticing? Who had access? Who knew when inspections happened? Who understood the value of the syrup? Who had the equipment to transport it? Who had somewhere to put it? And perhaps the most important question of all was this: where had the syrup gone? The answer would not be found in the warehouse. It was already moving through a much larger world. It was traveling through roads and warehouses, through commercial transactions and supply chains, across provincial borders, and eventually toward the United States. The stolen syrup was not simply disappearing. It was being transformed from inventory into merchandise, from merchandise into money, and that meant the people behind the theft did not necessarily need to hide the syrup forever. They only needed to make it look legitimate. That is what made the crime so difficult to understand. The thieves had not stolen something that could easily be locked inside a basement and forgotten. They had stolen a commodity, a product that could be sold, a product that was already being bought and sold every day. And because maple syrup was a legitimate business, the stolen product could move inside the same channels as legitimate product. A truck carrying syrup did not automatically look suspicious. A barrel of syrup did not announce that it had been stolen. A buyer could see a shipment and see only a shipment. A seller could see a transaction and see only money. The crime could hide inside ordinary commerce. That was the genius of the scheme, and perhaps also its greatest weakness. Because every transaction leaves a trace. Every truck needs a destination. Every warehouse needs a door. Every barrel has to come from somewhere. Every buyer has to pay someone. And eventually, somebody notices that the numbers do not add up. But in the summer of 2012, investigators were still standing at the beginning of that trail. They knew something enormous had happened. They did not yet know exactly who was responsible. They did not yet know how many people were involved. They did not know how far the stolen syrup had traveled. And they certainly did not know that the investigation would eventually lead them beyond Quebec. The first question was simple: how much was missing? The answer was staggering. More than 18 million Canadian dollars worth of syrup, 6 million pounds of product, thousands of barrels, a fortune hidden in plain sight. The sheer scale made one thing immediately obvious: this could not have been an impulsive theft. Someone had not walked into the warehouse one afternoon, seen an opportunity, and suddenly decided to steal maple syrup. The operation required planning. It required transportation. It required storage. It required buyers. It required knowledge. And above all, it required time. Time was perhaps the most important ingredient in the entire crime. The thieves needed the warehouse to remain quiet. They needed inspections to remain predictable. They needed the people responsible for the inventory to believe that the barrels were still there. And they needed to remove enough syrup to make enormous profits without creating an obvious gap. That is why replacing the syrup with water mattered. It was not just a bizarre detail. It was evidence of planning. A barrel full of water could still look like a barrel full of syrup from the outside. The weight was wrong, but unless someone checked carefully, the deception could survive. The criminals had found a way to create the appearance of abundance after the actual product was gone. The warehouse could look full while the fortune inside, it was being drained away. It was a deception built around human expectation. People tend to see what they expect to see. If a warehouse is supposed to contain thousands of barrels of syrup, and thousands of barrels are visibly sitting in the warehouse, the natural assumption is that the syrup is still there. The criminals did not need to make the barrels disappear. They only needed to make the syrup disappear. That distinction would become central to the entire investigation, and it raises another question. Why was there so much maple syrup stored in one place in the first place? To understand that, you have to understand Quebec. For generations, maple syrup had been more than a sweet topping poured over pancakes. In Quebec, it was an industry, a tradition, a source of income, a symbol of the province itself. The spring maple harvest connected farms, forests, families, producers, distributors, and buyers. When the season was good, enormous quantities of syrup entered the market. When production was lower, reserves could help stabilize supply. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers maintained strategic reserves partly for that reason. The syrup stored in warehouses represented future supply. It represented economic security, and in 2011, an unusually productive season helped fill those reserves. Millions of pounds of syrup were gathered and stored. A commodity designed to protect the industry from shortages had accumulated in enormous quantities. And somewhere along the way, someone looked at all that syrup and saw an opportunity. The opportunity was not merely to steal. It was to exploit the difference between the physical reality inside the warehouse and the reality recorded on paper. The barrels could remain. The records could remain. The syrup could leave. And money could take its place. That was the architecture of the crime. But there is something else worth remembering. A theft of this size does not begin with millions of dollars. It begins with a decision. Someone has to look at a system and decide that the rules do not apply to them. Someone has to look at a warehouse full of valuable goods and imagine taking them. Someone has to make the first call, the first arrangement, the first delivery, the first illegal transaction. And once that first step succeeds, the next one becomes easier. One barrel becomes several. Several become a truckload. A truckload becomes hundreds of barrels. And eventually, the crime becomes so large that stopping it requires the criminals to either abandon the operation or become more confident. The people behind the maple syrup theft became more confident. They kept going. For months, the absence of cameras and sophisticated alarm systems gave them room to operate. The warehouse was not designed as a fortress. It was a storage facility, and storage facilities depend on something very different from the security of a bank. They depend on routine. Workers come and go. Trucs arrivent. Trucks leave. Barrels are moved. Inventory is updated. People trust the system. The thieves did not need to defeat a sophisticated security network. They needed to understand a human one. They needed to know when people looked, and when they did not. They needed to know which barrels could be moved, where the syrup could go, who might ask questions, who would not. And they needed to keep the operation quiet enough that the missing product would not be noticed until they were already far away. For nearly a year, the plan worked. Then Michel Gavreau touched a barrel, and the illusion began to collapse. The discovery of water where syrup should have been was more than a strange anomaly. It was the first visible crack in a carefully maintained deception. Behind that crack was an enormous criminal network, and beyond that network were trucks carrying stolen syrup away from Quebec. Investigators would eventually follow those shipments. They would interview hundreds of people. They would search facilities. They would trace transactions. They would cross borders. They would recover millions of dollars worth of syrup. And eventually, one name would emerge as a central figure, Richard Vallières. But at the moment when the missing syrup was first discovered, his name meant nothing to the investigators standing inside that warehouse. They had no map. No complete list of suspects. No clear picture of the operation. They had only the barrels. Thousands of them. Some still full. Some empty. Some filled with water. And between those barrels was a question that would drive the investigation for years. How do you steal 6 million pounds of maple syrup without anyone seeing you? The answer would reveal that the greatest thefts do not always look like crimes when they are happening. Sometimes they look like work. Sometimes they look like commerce. Sometimes they look like another truck leaving a warehouse. And sometimes the most valuable thing in the building is something as ordinary as a barrel of syrup. Until someone opens it. Until someone checks the weight. Until someone realizes that what should be there is gone. By then, the thieves had already had months to disappear. But they had made one mistake. They had left the barrels behind. And inside those barrels, investigators would find the beginning of the trail. To understand how someone could steal millions of dollars worth of maple syrup, you first have to understand why anyone would bother stealing it in the first place. From a distance, the idea sounds almost ridiculous. Maple syrup belongs on breakfast tables. It is poured over pancakes. It is drizzled onto waffles. It is sold in small glass bottles in grocery stores, often placed beside honey and jam. It does not look like the kind of commodity that needs a strategic reserve. It does not look like something that requires police escorts. And it certainly does not look like something criminals would risk years of their lives to steal. But Quebec's maple syrup industry operates on a scale that makes the little bottles sitting on supermarket shelves almost meaningless. The province is one of the dominant producers of maple syrup in the world. For thousands of producers, maple is not simply a seasonal tradition. It is an industry built around forests, weather, harvesting equipment, processing facilities, contracts, transportation, export markets, and carefully managed supply. And when you control a large share of a commodity, you have to think beyond what is happening today. You have to think about next year's harvest, the year after that, a bad spring, a warm winter, a poor yield, a sudden increase in demand, a shortage somewhere else in the world. That was the reason for the reserve. The Fédération de Producteurs de Céréales du Québec maintained a strategic stockpile of maple syrup, a reserve designed to help stabilize the industry when production and demand did not line up. The syrup sitting inside the warehouse at St. Louis de Blanford was therefore not random inventory. It was part of a larger economic system. It represented future supply. It represented security. And in the summer of 2011, the warehouse became the temporary home of an enormous quantity of that reserve. The Federation rented the facility in June. Within the building, thousands of barrels were arranged in rows. 16,000 barrels would eventually be associated with the stockpiles stored there. Imagine standing at the entrance and looking down one of those rows, barrel after barrel, metal cylinders disappearing into the distance, then another row, and another. The sheer quantity would make it difficult for the human mind to appreciate what was actually there. A person could walk through the warehouse and see nothing more than industrial storage. But behind every metal wall was a valuable commodity. The barrels were heavy because maple syrup is heavy. A full barrel could weigh hundreds of pounds. Move one, and you needed equipment. Move dozens, and you needed planning. Move hundreds, and you needed trucks. Move thousands, and you needed an organization. That distinction would eventually become one of the central facts of the case. The theft could not have been a spontaneous act. Someone had to understand the warehouse. Someone had to understand the barrels. Someone had to understand transportation. Someone had to understand the maple syrup market. And someone had to understand the weaknesses of the system protecting all of it. The warehouse had a fence. It had locks. It was visited regularly. But it did not have the kind of security people might expect when millions of dollars are sitting inside. There were no cameras watching every aisle. There was no sophisticated alarm system constantly monitoring the barrels. There was no bank-style vault door between the syrup and the outside world. The Federation later maintained that the warehouse was secured and visited regularly. But the criminals did not need to break through the fence. They did not need to destroy the locks. They did not need to storm the building. They needed access. And access was something that existed inside the normal operation of the warehouse. That is an important difference. A traditional robbery begins with force. This one began with familiarity. The people involved understood how the facility worked. They knew that barrels came and went. They knew the syrup was stored temporarily. They understood that inventory was not being watched every minute of every day. And they understood something else. The barrels did not necessarily have to disappear. Only their contents did. That simple idea changed everything. A thief who steals a barrel has to explain the missing barrel. A thief who steals the syrup and leaves the barrel behind creates a much smaller visual disturbance. The metal cylinder remains where it was. The space remains occupied. The warehouse still looks full. Only the weight has changed. And unless someone checks that weight, the deception can survive. That was the vulnerability. The criminals allegedly exploited it for months. The syrup was drained from the barrels. The stolen liquid was transferred into other containers. The barrels were then refilled with water. And the water sat there, pretending to be millions of dollars worth of maple syrup. Think about how strange that scene would have looked if anyone had known what was happening. A worker might walk past a row of barrels without suspicion. A forklift might move one from one place to another. A truck might arrive and leave. The ordinary rhythm of a warehouse continued. But hidden inside those barrels was an extraordinary deception. The syrup was gone. The barrel remained. The outside appearance remained. Only the truth had disappeared. And while the warehouse maintained the illusion of abundance, the stolen syrup was moving into another world. It could be poured into other barrels. It could be placed into plastic containers. It could be loaded onto large tractor trailers. It could travel hundreds of kilometers. Once it left the warehouse, it no longer looked like stolen property. It looked like maple syrup. That was the dangerous simplicity of the scheme. There was no serial number printed across every drop. No unique electronic tracker embedded inside the liquid. No alarm attached to each barrel. Once the syrup was removed from its original storage container, it could be moved, sold, and blended into ordinary commercial activity. The criminals had effectively transformed a warehouse theft into a supply chain crime. And that meant the investigation would eventually have to follow the syrup rather than simply follow the thieves. But in 2011, no one was thinking about that yet. The warehouse was still functioning. The reserve was still being counted. The syrup was still supposed to be there. And the first thefts could have looked insignificant when viewed one at a time. A barrel missing its contents. Another. Another. The kind of discrepancy that could perhaps be explained by an error, a paperwork problem, a temporary transfer, a misunderstanding. That is how large crimes can hide inside ordinary systems. They do not always announce themselves with one dramatic event. Sometimes they grow quietly. One small violation becomes another. One person crosses a line. Someone else realizes the line can be crossed again. The opportunity becomes a routine. The routine becomes an operation. And eventually, the operation becomes so large that the people involved begin to believe they are untouchable. The alleged theft reportedly began around August 2011. At roughly the same time, the warehouse was still relatively new to the Federation. The stockpile had been moved into the facility only weeks earlier. That timing matters. The people involved were not simply walking into a warehouse that had been operating unchanged for decades. They were dealing with a temporary storage location, holding an enormous amount of valuable product. A perfect target, if you knew how to exploit it. The syrup was already there. The barrels were already there. The buyers existed. The transportation network existed. The market existed. All that was missing was a bridge between the warehouse and the black market. According to later court records, that bridge involved multiple people. Richard Valliers would eventually emerge as one of the central figures, but he was not operating alone. Another man, Avik Karen, would become associated with the physical operation at the warehouse. According to the later Supreme Court record, Valliers and Karen met in June 2011 and planned to steal maple syrup from one of the Federation's warehouses and resell it on the black market. Karen and accomplices handled the theft operation at St. Louis to Blandford. The stolen syrup was emptied from barrels, the barrels were refilled with water, and the syrup was transferred into other barrels or plastic containers. Large tractor trailers then became part of the transportation system. The scale of those vehicles tells its own story. A crime involving millions of pounds cannot be hidden inside the trunk of a car. It cannot be carried away in backpacks. It cannot be moved one suitcase at a time. It requires logistics, routes, drivers, loading, unloading, storage, buyers, and communication. It requires people who know what they're doing. That is what makes this case so different from the image of a simple warehouse burglary. The warehouse was only the beginning. The real crime was the network that formed around the stolen syrup. And every network needs information. Someone had to know when people would inspect the inventory. Someone had to know which areas of the warehouse were accessible. Someone had to understand how the barrels were handled. Someone had to know how much syrup could be removed before the missing quantity became obvious. Someone had to understand where the stolen product could go. The criminals were not simply stealing an object. They were manipulating a system. They were taking advantage of the gap between what the record said existed and what physically existed inside the barrels. For a while, that gap remained invisible. The warehouse continued to look like a warehouse full of syrup. The reserve remained on paper. The barrels remained in place, and the outside world had no reason to suspect that a fortune was being siphoned away. But there were people nearby who noticed something. The warehouse sat along a road where unusual traffic was difficult to ignore. According to later reporting, a nearby resident, Raymond Pepin, became suspicious of the number of trucks using the road. They appeared at unusual times, late at night, early in the morning, even on weekends. A truck at midnight is not automatically suspicious. A truck on Sunday morning is not automatically suspicious. One unusual vehicle can be explained, then another arrives, and another. Eventually, repetition becomes its own kind of evidence. The road was telling a story, but no one yet knew what the story meant. That is one of the haunting elements of the case. There were people outside the warehouse who saw pieces of the operation without understanding its purpose. A truck moving through the darkness. A gate left open. A lock that appeared to have been cut. Activity at hours when most people would expect the warehouse to be quiet. To someone who did not know what was inside, it might have looked like routine industrial work. Perhaps a shipment. Perhaps maintenance. Perhaps someone working late. There was no obvious reason to think that millions of dollars were being stolen. And that is exactly what the thieves needed. They did not need everyone to believe they were innocent. They only needed no one to have enough information to understand the entire picture. One person sees a truck. Another sees a worker. Another sees a barrel. Another sees a shipment. Another sees a commercial transaction. No one sees the whole operation. The crime survives in the gaps between those observations. Meanwhile, the syrup kept moving. The stolen product did not remain in Quebec. It began traveling outward. Some of it moved toward Ontario. Some toward New Brunswick. Some eventually reached the United States. And every kilometer it traveled created another layer between the warehouse and the original theft. By the time a buyer encountered the syrup, it might no longer be obvious where it came from. That is the advantage of a commodity crime. The stolen object can become indistinguishable from legitimate inventory. A stolen television has a serial number. A stolen car has a vehicle identification number. A stolen painting has a history. Maple syrup can be poured from one container into another. The physical evidence changes form. The identity of the stolen property becomes harder to see. That would later make the recovery operation extraordinarily complicated. Police were not simply looking for a pile of barrels with the word stolen written across them. They were looking for millions of pounds of syrup that had already entered commercial channels. They had to determine who had bought it, who had transported it, who had stored it, who knew where it came from, and who, if anyone, had simply purchased it without realizing that it was connected to a massive criminal operation. This distinction would matter, because not everyone who touched the stolen syrup was necessarily a willing participant. Some people would claim they had purchased it legitimately. Some would maintain their innocence. Some would become suspects. Others would become witnesses. And investigators would have to separate them. But all of that was still in the future. In the summer of 2011, the operation was just beginning. The barrels were still stacked inside the warehouse. The syrup was still being counted. The reserve still looked secure. And somewhere in the chain of people who had access to that warehouse, a decision had been made. A decision to take something that did not belong to them. At first, perhaps, the scale was small enough to feel manageable. A few barrels. A few £100. A few $1,000s. Then the money began to accumulate. The operation expanded. More syrup disappeared. More trucks moved. More people became involved. And with every successful theft, the risk calculation changed. The criminals learned that they could do it. They learned that no alarm stopped them. No camera recorded them. No immediate inventory check exposed them. The barrels could be emptied. The water could be added. The warehouse could be left looking normal. Success creates confidence, and confidence can become recklessness. By the time the thieves had taken millions of pounds of syrup, they were no longer committing a small theft. They were running an operation worth millions of dollars. And yet the warehouse still appeared to contain the reserve. That illusion continued until the summer of 2012, almost a year after the alleged theft began. Almost a year of trucks. Almost a year of missing syrup. Almost a year of water quietly sitting where the valuable liquid should have been. Then came the inventory check. And this time, someone looked closely. Michel Gavreau did not arrive expecting to uncover a conspiracy. He arrived to perform an audit. He was doing the kind of work that normally produces paperwork, numbers, signatures, and little else. But on July 30th, 2012, according to the later timeline of the investigation, he climbed onto a stack of barrels. He reached toward one of them, and something went wrong. He lost his balance after reaching for an empty barrel. That moment may have looked insignificant. A man climbing among barrels. A routine inspection. An awkward movement. But the barrel he was reaching for was empty. At least 30 barrels appeared to be empty. And suddenly, the numbers did not make sense. Gavreau notified the Federation. The following month, the investigation would confirm what that first inspection suggested. The barrels were not full of syrup. Many had been filled with water. The treasure had been stolen. The deception had finally been exposed. And now the criminals had a problem. For almost a year, the warehouse had protected them. Now the warehouse was becoming the scene of their undoing. The same barrels they had left behind would become evidence. The same supply chain they had used to make money would become a trail. The same trucks that had helped them move the syrup would become clues. The same buyers who had helped turn stolen syrup into cash would become part of the investigation. The theft had been designed to disappear into ordinary commerce. But commerce leaves records, and roads leave witnesses, and people talk. The first stage of the investigation would begin with a question that sounded almost impossible. Where had 6 million pounds of maple syrup gone? The answer was scattered across Canada and beyond. And to find it, investigators would have to reconstruct the theft backward. They would have to start with the empty barrels, then the trucks, then the warehouses, then the buyers, then the money. And somewhere along that trail was the person who understood how to turn a warehouse full of maple syrup into a fortune. His name was Richard Vallières, but investigators were not there yet. First, they had to understand the warehouse. They had to understand how the criminals entered. how they moved the syrup, how they replaced it with water, and how an operation this large had managed to remain invisible for so long. Because the strangest thing about the Great Canadian Maple Syrup heist was never simply that someone stole $18 million worth of syrup. The strangest thing was that for months, the evidence of the theft was sitting exactly where it had always been. Thousands of barrels, thousands of silent witnesses, and inside them, instead of the golden liquid that everyone believed was there, ordinary water. The criminals had hidden the absence of a fortune inside the appearance of a fortune. And for nearly a year, nobody looked closely enough to see the difference. By the time the first empty barrels were discovered, the theft had already become something much larger than a burglary. It had become a disappearance. 6 million pounds of maple syrup had vanished from a warehouse in Quebec. Yet the building itself had not been emptied. The barrels were still there. The shelves were still standing. The doors were still functioning. The warehouse had not been torn apart by desperate thieves searching for a way in. The evidence of the crime was hidden inside objects that were still sitting exactly where they were expected to be. That was what made the discovery so disturbing. The warehouse had been designed to hold a reserve. It had been designed around the assumption that what was recorded as being there would actually be there. But the criminals had separated those two realities. On paper, there was syrup. Inside the barrels, there was water. And between those two facts was an $18 million deception. For months, the warehouse had been telling everyone a lie. Every row of barrels seemed to confirm that the reserve was intact. Every familiar shape suggested the same thing. The syrup was there. The stockpile was secure. The numbers were real. But the numbers were no longer describing reality. They were describing what someone wanted the owners to believe. That distinction is easy to overlook when discussing the case years later. It is tempting to reduce the entire crime to one strange image: thieves stealing maple syrup and replacing it with water. But the water was not the crime. The water was the disguise. The real crime was the system behind it. Someone had to identify the opportunity. Someone had to understand the weaknesses. Someone had to organize the removal. Someone had to find a way to transport enormous quantities of syrup. Someone had to locate buyers. And someone had to convince enough people that nothing unusual was happening. That is where the story becomes less amusing and much darker. Because behind the bizarre headline was a carefully coordinated operation involving people, vehicles, warehouses, money, and trust. The syrup itself was only the commodity. The real currency was information. Who knew what? Who knew when? Who knew where? Who knew how much? And who knew enough to remain silent? The answers would emerge slowly. At first, investigators had almost nothing that resembled a traditional crime scene. There was no body. There was no broken window. There was no abandoned weapon. There was no dramatic confession waiting at the end of a fingerprint. Instead, there were barrels. Thousands of barrels. Some were full. Some were empty. Some had been refilled. And somewhere among them were clues to how the theft had been carried out. Investigators had to begin by understanding the physical movement of the syrup. That meant asking a deceptively simple question: how do you move 6 million pounds? The answer was heavy. Very heavy. 6 million pounds is roughly 3,000 tons. It is an amount that changes the nature of a crime. A person cannot carry it. A small group cannot hide it in private vehicles. Even a single truck cannot move it all. The operation required repeated transportation. It required industrial equipment. It required loading and unloading. It required places where the syrup could be stored after leaving the warehouse. And it required buyers capable of absorbing enormous quantities of product. That meant the theft could not exist entirely inside the warehouse. The warehouse was only the first link. The second link was transportation. The third was storage. The fourth was distribution. And somewhere after that came the money. This was why investigators could not simply arrest the first person who had access to the facility. They needed to understand the network. If they arrested one person without understanding the network, the remaining syrup could disappear. People could warn one another. Records could be destroyed. Money could move. Vehicles could be relocated. Warehouses could be emptied. And the stolen product could cross another border. The clock was already running. The moment the theft became public, every person connected to it had a reason to protect themselves. But there was another problem. The thieves had enjoyed nearly a year of freedom. They had time to build distance between themselves and the original crime. A barrel removed from the warehouse in 2011 might have been sold to someone months later. That buyer might have sold it again. The syrup might have been processed. It might have been combined with other syrup. It might have been transported across a provincial border. It might have crossed into the United States. By the time investigators found it, the syrup could be several transactions away from the warehouse where it had originally been stolen. This is the kind of distance that makes a criminal investigation difficult. The physical object survives, but its story becomes fragmented. The investigators had to reconstruct that story. They had to find the missing chapters. And the first chapters were buried in the routines of the people who worked around the warehouse. The people who drove the trucks. The people who knew the roads. The people who bought syrup. The people who stored it. The people who sold it. The people who knew how the industry worked. Hundreds of conversations would eventually become part of the investigation. But before those conversations could begin, investigators needed to know where to look. One of the first important clues came from outside the warehouse itself, the road. A road does not care what is inside a truck. It does not care whether the cargo is legitimate. It simply carries vehicles from one place to another. But people notice patterns. A local resident named Raymond Pepin reportedly became suspicious of the amount of truck traffic associated with the warehouse. The vehicles were appearing at unusual times. Night, early morning, weekends. The kind of traffic that might seem meaningless once, but repetition changes perception. One truck is nothing. Several trucks can be coincidence. A regular pattern begins to look like something else. Pepin did not know that the trucks were carrying stolen maple syrup. He did not know that millions of dollars were leaving the warehouse. He simply noticed activity that seemed unusual. That is one of the recurring themes in the case. The clues were not hidden because nobody saw them. They were hidden because nobody understood what they meant. A truck was just a truck. A barrel was just a barrel. A warehouse worker was just a warehouse worker. A shipment was just a shipment. It was only after the theft was discovered that these ordinary details became suspicious. Suddenly, the past had to be reinterpreted. A truck that had seemed irrelevant might now matter. A person who had seemed ordinary might now need to be questioned. A delivery that had seemed routine might now represent part of the theft. Investigators were forced to look backward. And looking backward is difficult because human memory is not a perfect recording device. People remember what seemed important at the time. They forget what did not. A truck might have been noticed, but its license plate forgotten. A driver might have been seen, but not remembered. A conversation might have seemed meaningless until months later. The investigation therefore became an enormous exercise in reconstruction. What had happened before anyone knew something had happened? That question would eventually lead police far beyond the warehouse. The first major breakthrough came from following the syrup itself. Some of the stolen product had moved toward New Brunswick. That was important because the syrup was no longer simply missing. It was becoming visible. It was entering another market. On September 25, 2012, investigators searched a facility connected to Etienne Saint-Pierre in Kedgwick, New Brunswick. There they found maple syrup worth approximately 1.6 million Canadian dollars, along with equipment associated with handling the product. Suddenly, investigators had something tangible. Not just an empty barrel, not just a suspicious truck, not just a discrepancy in an inventory report. Syrup. A significant quantity of syrup, and the question became immediate. Where had it come from? Who had supplied it? Who had sold it? Who had paid for it? The investigation was beginning to move backward through the supply chain. The syrup had traveled, and if investigators could trace its movement, perhaps they could trace the people behind the theft. This is where the story began to change. The warehouse was no longer the center of the investigation. The market became the center. Every legitimate transaction created a possible trail, a payment, a delivery, a phone call, a shipment, a storage facility, a buyer. The criminals had believed they were making the stolen syrup disappear by putting it into commerce. But commerce created records. The very system that allowed them to profit also created the evidence that could expose them. And slowly, investigators began finding names. One of those names was Richard Valliers. Valliers was not a random outsider who had wandered into the maple syrup business by accident. He understood the industry. He understood the value of the product. He understood buyers. And according to the later court record, he became one of the central figures in the effort to sell the stolen syrup. That distinction is important. The person who physically removes a barrel from a warehouse is not necessarily the person who makes the most money from it. A criminal operation can divide responsibilities. One person handles access. Another handles transportation. Another handles storage. Another finds buyers. Another handles the money. This division creates distance. It also creates protection. If one person is caught, they may know only part of the operation. The investigators, therefore, had to determine who knew what and when. The question was not simply whether Valliers had been involved. It was how his involvement fit into the larger structure. The investigation would eventually reveal a network in which stolen syrup could be moved through several hands before reaching an apparently legitimate buyer. That created another problem. Not every buyer was necessarily a criminal. A person purchasing maple syrup does not automatically know that it has been stolen. A business may receive a shipment with documents that appear legitimate. The product may look perfectly normal. The price may be attractive but not impossible. The seller may appear experienced. The transaction may resemble thousands of others in the industry. That meant investigators had to distinguish between deliberate participation and unwitting involvement. The difference could be the difference between a witness and a suspect, between someone who had unknowingly purchased stolen property and someone who had knowingly helped move it. That distinction would become especially important when the investigation reached the United States. Some of the stolen syrup eventually crossed the border. One company connected to the investigation was Maple Grove Farms in Vermont. The company maintained that it had purchased syrup without knowing it was stolen. That claim illustrated the challenge facing investigators. The syrup had become almost invisible. It did not look criminal. It looked like syrup. The crime was hidden not in the appearance of the product, but in its history. And history is much harder to see. A barrel does not reveal who filled it. A shipment does not reveal who stole it. A purchase order does not necessarily reveal the original source. The deeper investigators went, the more complicated the story became. They were no longer looking for a thief. They were looking for a chain. And chains have links. Some links break. Some links cooperate. Some links deny everything. Some links know exactly what is happening. The challenge is discovering which is which. By late 2012, the investigation had grown large enough that multiple law enforcement agencies were involved. The Charité du Québec led the provincial investigation. Other agencies became involved as the syrup crossed provincial and international boundaries. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police became part of the broader investigative picture. Canadian border authorities had a role when goods crossed the border. American authorities became relevant when the trail reached the United States. What had started as a warehouse theft was now an international investigation, and all of it had begun with a barrel that weighed too little. That image is worth returning to. A barrel. A simple metal container, heavy enough that moving it required machinery, ordinary enough that nobody would normally look twice at it. Yet inside that barrel was the central contradiction of the entire case. The outside said one thing. The inside said another. The outside said the reserve remained intact. The inside said millions of dollars were gone. That contradiction was the criminal operation in miniature. And perhaps that is why the case became so fascinating. It was not a robbery in the traditional sense. It was an illusion. The thieves did not need the world to believe that nothing had happened forever. They only needed it to believe that nothing had happened long enough. Long enough to move the syrup. Long enough to sell it. Long enough to collect money. Long enough to separate themselves from the evidence. The strategy depended on delay. And for nearly a year, delay worked. Then the inventory happened. Once the discrepancy was discovered, the entire structure began collapsing. Investigators began looking at the warehouse differently. The roads around it looked different. The trucks looked different. The people connected to the facility looked different. And the financial transactions surrounding the maple syrup market began to take on new significance. What had once appeared to be ordinary business was now evidence. A shipment could become a lead. A buyer could become a witness. A storage facility could become a search location. A name could become a suspect. The investigation was expanding outward, but it was also moving backward. Investigators needed to reconstruct the beginning. Who first planned the theft? Who first realized the reserve could be exploited? Who first walked into the warehouse and looked at those barrels not as syrup but as money? The answer would eventually point toward a group of men who understood the business well enough to recognize a weakness that most people would never have noticed. The strategic reserve was valuable because it was concentrated. That concentration was also its vulnerability. Millions of dollars were sitting together. The product was valuable. The market existed. And the security system was based largely on trust and periodic verification. For a person willing to cross the legal line, the opportunity was enormous. But opportunity alone does not create a multi-million-dollar theft. Someone has to act. Someone has to recruit. Someone has to organize. Someone has to find a market. And once the first syrup was stolen, someone had to make the decision to continue. Again. And again. And again. The operation became a machine. The warehouse supplied the syrup. The trucks supplied movement. The buyers supplied money. And the people in the middle connected all three. Richard Valliers would become one of the most important names in that middle ground. But the case against him would not be built overnight. There would be arrests, interviews, searches, recovered syrup, court proceedings, and years of legal arguments. The story would eventually reach the highest court in Canada. But before that happened, investigators had to peel back the layers of the theft. They had to identify the people who had turned a quiet warehouse into a source of illegal wealth. They had to determine how the barrels had been emptied. They had to determine where the syrup had gone. They had to determine who had purchased it. And they had to determine who knew it was stolen. Because the most difficult crimes are not always the ones where the evidence is absent. Sometimes they're the crimes where there is too much evidence, scattered across too many people and too many places. This case was becoming exactly that. Hundreds of people would eventually be interviewed. The trail would extend across Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and into the United States. Millions of dollars worth of syrup would be recovered, and the investigation would expose how an ordinary commodity could become the centerpiece of an extraordinary criminal enterprise. But there was still one question hanging over everything. How had the criminals been able to operate for so long? The answer was not simply that security was weak. It was that the system had been built around an assumption. The assumption that people would not steal millions of dollars worth of maple syrup. It sounds absurd when said aloud. Who would steal maple syrup? Who would risk prison for barrels of syrup? Who would build an organized criminal network around a product that most people associate with breakfast? The criminals understood something that outsiders did not. They understood that absurdity could be a form of camouflage. The more unusual the crime sounded, the harder it was to imagine someone actually doing it. And perhaps that was the psychological advantage. Nobody expects a maple syrup warehouse to become the scene of a multimillion-dollar theft. Nobody walks past a truck carrying syrup and thinks, automatically, that the cargo might be stolen. Nobody sees a barrel and imagines that its contents are worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. The criminals knew the value. Most people did not. That difference in knowledge created the opportunity. And once the opportunity was discovered, the theft could be repeated. The operation did not need violence. It needed patience. It did not need intimidation. It needed access. It did not need a sophisticated hacking system. It needed an understanding of human routines. And it did not need to hide the barrels. It only needed to hide the truth inside them. That truth had remained hidden until July 2012. Then an inventory clerk noticed the weight. A barrel was too light. Then another. Then another. And suddenly, the illusion was over. The warehouse that had once looked like a treasure house now looked like a crime scene. Every barrel became suspicious. Every movement became significant. Every truck became worth remembering. The investigators now knew they were dealing with something enormous. They just did not yet know how enormous. They would soon discover that the missing syrup represented a fortune. They would discover that the theft had been taking place for months. They would discover that the syrup had traveled across provincial borders. They would discover that some of it had reached the United States. They would discover that the operation involved more people than a single thief. And eventually, they would discover that one of the men at the center of the network had earned roughly $1 million from the stolen syrup. But at this stage, investigators had only fragments. A warehouse, empty barrels, water, truck traffic, a shipment in New Brunswick, and a growing list of names. The pieces did not yet form a complete picture, but they were beginning to connect. The road outside the warehouse led somewhere. The trucks had destinations. The syrup had buyers. The money had recipients. And the empty barrels had been left behind. That was the mistake. The criminals had believed the barrels would protect them. They believed that if the warehouse still looked full, the theft could remain invisible. But the barrels had done the opposite. They had preserved the evidence of what had happened. Every barrel that contained water was a silent witness. It could not speak. It could not identify the person who emptied it. It could not say which truck carried away its contents. But it proved one thing. Someone had been inside. Someone had taken the syrup. Someone had expected nobody to notice. And now, someone was going to have to answer for it. The greatest maple syrup theft in Canadian history was no longer a secret. The hunt had begun, and the investigators were about to discover that the road from an ordinary warehouse in Quebec to an $18 million crime led through a world of middlemen, hidden transactions, long-distance trucking, black market deals, and carefully constructed lies. The syrup had left the warehouse, but it had not vanished. It had left a trail. And somewhere at the end of that trail were the people who believed they could steal a fortune in broad daylight, hide it inside ordinary commerce, and walk away. They were wrong. Because while the syrup could be moved, the story of the syrup could not disappear quite so easily. Every barrel had a past. Every shipment had a destination. Every buyer had a reason. And every person involved would eventually have to decide what to do when the police came asking questions. That was when the real story began, long before the barrels were stacked inside a warehouse in St. Louis to Blandford, before investigators would count thousands of containers and discover water where maple syrup should have been. The story began in a landscape where maple trees were not simply part of the scenery. They were part of life. Quebec in late winter can appear almost motionless. Snow stretches across fields and forests, covering the ground in a continuous sheet of white. Roads become narrow corridors between banks of snow. The trees stand dark and bare against a pale sky. In the early morning, temperatures can fall far below freezing, and the forest seems to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the season changes. The days become longer. The sun begins to climb higher, and something starts moving inside the trees. For maple producers, That movement is the beginning of a yearly ritual, when the temperature rises above freezing during the day, but falls below freezing at night. Pressure changes inside sugar maple trees allow sap to flow. The trees are tapped. Buckets and tubing collect the clear liquid. The sap is transported, and eventually, through heat and evaporation, water is removed until what remains becomes the thick, sweet syrup that the world recognizes. It is a deceptively simple process. A tree, a tap, a bucket or tube, heat, time. But behind that simple process lies a massive agricultural industry, and nowhere is that industry more important than Quebec. For generations, maple production had been tied to rural communities across the province. Families worked sugar bushes in the spring. Producers invested in equipment. Buyers developed relationships. Processing operations expanded. Markets grew. The syrup became part of Quebec's identity. But as the industry expanded, it also became more complicated. Maple syrup was no longer simply something a family produced and sold locally. It was a commodity moving through a global market. That meant supply mattered, demand mattered, prices mattered, and production could fluctuate dramatically from one year to another. A warm spring could produce an enormous crop. A poor season could create shortages. Weather could change the balance between supply and demand before producers had any control over it. That uncertainty created the need for reserves. The Fédération de producteurs de céréales du Québec, commonly known by its French initials, FPQ, played a central role in organizing and regulating the province's maple syrup industry. One of its functions was to help manage supply. That meant syrup produced during particularly strong seasons could be stored rather than immediately flooding the market. The concept was straightforward. If too much syrup entered the market at once, prices could fall. If production dropped later, stored syrup could help meet demand. The reserve therefore acted as a buffer, a reservoir of sweetness, a stockpile designed to protect an industry built around a crop that depended on the weather. It was an unusual form of wealth. The reserve did not glitter. It did not make a sound. It sat quietly inside barrels. But economically, it could be worth millions. And by 2011, an unusually productive season had created a problem that was also an opportunity. There was a lot of syrup, more than the market immediately needed, so large quantities entered storage. One of the facilities chosen for this purpose was located in St. Louis de Blanford. The town itself was not the kind of place outsiders would associate with a major criminal investigation. It was rural Quebec. Quiet roads, fields, farms, forested areas, industrial buildings separated by stretches of open land. The landscape did not announce that something extraordinary was about to happen. There were no skyscrapers, no crowded streets, no constant stream of pedestrians, no reason for outsiders to pay much attention to an ordinary warehouse. That quietness would eventually become part of the story. The warehouse was not located in the middle of a major city, where every unusual vehicle might attract attention. It stood in an environment where commercial traffic could come and go without immediately creating a spectacle. For the people who lived nearby, trucks were part of the landscape. Agricultural communities depend on transportation. Products have to move. Equipment has to move. Materials have to move. A truck arriving at a warehouse is not, by itself, suspicious. And that ordinary appearance gave the future thieves an advantage. But there was another advantage. The maple syrup itself looked harmless. A barrel filled with syrup does not look like a fortune. It looks like a barrel. The human brain is trained to recognize certain objects as valuable. Gold bars, jewelry, cash, rare paintings. But maple syrup does not trigger the same instinct. Even when the quantity becomes enormous, the individual object remains visually ordinary. One barrel, then another, then another. The value is hidden in the accumulation. A single barrel might not attract attention. Thousands can be worth millions. That was the economic reality inside the warehouse. The syrup had value because there was so much of it, and the thieves understood that. The stockpile was essentially a concentration of wealth. It was the equivalent of a bank storing its money in metal drums. Only this bank did not have a vault, and it did not have armed guards. Its security depended on locks, access procedures, inventory records, and the expectation that the people around it were trustworthy. The warehouse had been rented by the Federation in 2011. The timing was significant. The facility was being used to store a large reserve at a moment when maple production had been strong. The barrels arrived. They were arranged. The inventory was recorded, and the building became a quiet repository of an enormous amount of economic value. Nothing about the process would have looked unusual to someone familiar with agricultural storage. That was the point. The warehouse was doing exactly what warehouses are supposed to do. It was storing something. The problem was that what it was storing was unusually valuable, and the security measures were not designed with the idea that someone might attempt to steal millions of dollars worth of syrup over an extended period. There was a basic assumption underlying the system. The syrup would remain where it had been placed. The barrels would remain intact. The inventory would be accurate. People would follow the rules. That assumption would become the foundation of the crime. In hindsight, investigators could identify the weaknesses. At the time, those weaknesses were simply part of normal operation. The warehouse did not have the level of surveillance that one might expect from a high-security financial facility. There were no sophisticated cameras monitoring every aisle. There was no constant electronic tracking system attached to every barrel. Inventory inspections occurred periodically rather than continuously. The system depended on verification at intervals. That meant there were gaps. And a gap is exactly what a patient criminal looks for. The thieves did not need to steal everything immediately. In fact, stealing everything immediately would have been the worst possible strategy. A sudden disappearance would have triggered an alarm. A truck carrying thousands of barrels would have been difficult to explain. An emptied warehouse would have been obvious. The clever approach was gradual. Remove some. Wait. Remove more. Replace the contents. Leave the exterior unchanged. Allow normal activity to continue. The warehouse could remain apparently full, while the actual value inside it steadily declined. It was a slow-motion robbery, the kind of crime that could continue precisely because it did not look like a robbery. That is one of the most important psychological elements of the case. People tend to imagine crime as a moment. A burglar enters. A thief grabs something. A robber escapes. But organized theft can be different. It can be repetitive, methodical, almost boring. The criminal may spend more time planning than acting. The danger is not in one dramatic act. It is in repetition. The first successful theft proves that the system can be exploited. The second makes the first seem less risky. The third creates confidence. Eventually, the abnormal becomes routine. That appears to have been the environment in which the maple syrup theft grew. The criminals discovered that they could move syrup without immediately being caught. The warehouse remained standing. The barrels remained in place. The inventory system did not immediately expose the discrepancy, and the market was waiting on the other side. This is where the geography of Quebec becomes important. The province is vast. Rural roads connect farms, processing plants, storage facilities, towns, and larger commercial centers. A tractor-trailer can leave a warehouse and quickly become just another vehicle on the highway. Once outside the building, the stolen syrup could disappear into the ordinary movement of goods. The same roads that carried legitimate agricultural products could carry stolen syrup. There was no special road for criminals, no special truck, no flashing sign. A vehicle could travel through the night without announcing what was inside. That anonymity mattered. The thieves were not trying to escape in a high-speed chase. They were trying to become invisible. And invisibility is easier when your cargo looks legitimate. The maple syrup industry itself provided another layer of camouflage. There were producers, buyers, brokers, processors, wholesalers, distributors, exporters, retailers. A commodity can change hands many times before reaching a consumer. Every transfer creates distance from the original source. That distance could protect the people who stole the syrup. If one person sold it to another, and that person sold it again, the final buyer might have no idea where the syrup originally came from. The product itself could be perfectly genuine. The crime existed in the chain of ownership. That made the future investigation unusually complex. The police would not simply need to recover stolen property. They would need to reconstruct the movement of a commodity. And to do that, they would need to understand the industry. They would need to understand how syrup was priced, how it was stored, how it was transported, how much a buyer normally purchased, what constituted a normal transaction, and what looked unusual. Investigators would eventually speak with hundreds of people, but before the investigation became large, the warehouse was quiet. The syrup was sitting there. The barrels were waiting. And the thieves were watching. The first step in a major theft often begins with observation. Where are the entrances? Who has keys? When are workers present? When is the warehouse empty? How often is inventory checked? What equipment is available? What roads lead away? Where could a truck stop without attracting attention? A person who does not understand the environment sees a warehouse. A person planning a crime sees a system. That difference is everything. The future criminals allegedly saw the system. They understood that the reserve represented enormous value. They understood that the syrup could be sold. They understood that transportation was possible. And they understood that the warehouse's security depended heavily on routine. Once that knowledge existed, the opportunity became difficult to ignore. But there was another factor: the market price of maple syrup. Prices could fluctuate, supply could fluctuate, and the strategic reserve itself existed because the industry was trying to manage that instability. That meant a large quantity of syrup sitting outside normal commercial circulation could potentially be worth a great deal. The criminals did not have to invent a market. The market already existed. They only had to insert stolen syrup into it. That is a crucial difference. The stolen goods were not exotic. There was no need to find a secret buyer for an impossible object. The product already had customers. People already wanted maple syrup. Companies already bought it. Consumers already recognized it. The criminals were therefore not creating demand. They were exploiting existing demand. And that made the operation much easier to conceal. The syrup could be sold as if it were ordinary inventory. The buyer could see a price. The seller could arrange delivery. A truck could transport it. Money could change hands. And the transaction could end. The only question was where the syrup had originally come from. That question would eventually become the central mystery. But for almost a year, no one was asking it. The warehouse continued to function. The reserve remained physically present. At least, that was what everyone believed. Inside some of the barrels, however, the syrup was gone. Water had taken its place. The transformation was almost symbolic. The criminals had not only stolen the product, they had replaced truth with appearance. They had turned a warehouse full of wealth into a warehouse full of deception. And the deception was remarkably simple. Water looks like nothing from outside a sealed barrel. It does not reveal itself. It does not announce that the syrup is gone. The only reliable way to detect the fraud is to check. Check the weight. Check the contents. Check the inventory. That is why the inspection was so important. It was not just a routine administrative process. It was the mechanism that finally broke the illusion. Until then, the criminals had been protected by the very routine that made the warehouse efficient. Periodic checks created a window. Inside that window, they could act. The longer the window remained open, the more syrup could disappear. The criminals apparently understood that. They did not need to defeat every safeguard. They needed only to operate between them. That is often how organized theft works. A security system can be strong in one moment and vulnerable across time. A lock can stop someone tonight. An inventory can expose a theft months later. But if the criminal can operate during the interval, the system becomes a race between detection and exploitation. In this case, exploitation won. For a while, the thieves had months. Months to move syrup. Months to sell it. Months to make money. Months to believe that the warehouse would not be checked closely enough. And then came the summer inventory. The first signs were physical. The barrels were too light. The contents were wrong. The numbers did not match reality. Once the discrepancy became undeniable, the entire history of the warehouse had to be reconsidered. Every shipment, every access record, every truck, every employee, every person who had handled the syrup, every person who knew the inventory. The investigation would eventually become one of the largest manhunts connected to food commodity theft in Canadian history. But the crime had begun quietly. No gunshot announced it. No alarm announced it. No witness saw a dramatic escape. There was only a barrel, and inside that barrel, water. The discovery revealed the physical truth, but it did not reveal the human truth. Who had done it? Why had they chosen maple syrup? How had they organized the operation? Who had helped them? Where had the syrup gone? And perhaps most importantly, how could so many people have been involved without the entire scheme collapsing sooner? Those questions would carry investigators across Quebec and beyond. The warehouse had been the beginning. The road would become the next chapter. Because once the syrup left the building, it had to travel. And travel creates witnesses. The trucks would leave records. The buyers would leave records. The money would leave records. The criminals had successfully hidden the theft from the inventory system, but they had entered a much larger system. And larger systems have a way of preserving traces. The thieves had believed they were taking syrup. In reality, they were creating a trail. Every barrel emptied was a piece of evidence. Every truckload was a potential lead. Every buyer was a possible witness. Every dollar earned was a possible financial connection. The operation had begun in silence. It would end in courtrooms. But before the final arrests, before the courtroom arguments, before Richard Valliere stood before a judge, there would be a long period in which investigators had to work backward through the disappearance. The first task was to determine the full scale. How many barrels? How much syrup? How much money? The answers were astonishing. Approximately 6 million pounds of syrup, thousands of barrels, more than 18 million Canadian dollars in value. A warehouse that looked full had been partially emptied. A reserve designed to protect an industry had been transformed into the target of one of the most audacious commodity thefts the country had ever seen. And the strangest part remained. The thieves had not needed to make the syrup disappear from sight. They only needed to make it disappear from the barrels. The barrels stayed. The warehouse stayed. The routine stayed. Only the syrup was gone. For months, nobody knew. Then someone checked. And once they did, the quiet warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford stopped being just a warehouse. It became the starting point of a criminal investigation that would stretch across provinces, across borders, and through an underground economy built around one of Canada's most recognizable products. The world had always associated maple syrup with sweetness. But inside that warehouse, sweetness had become money. Money had become temptation. And temptation had become a crime. The barrels were still standing. The syrup was not. And now, the people responsible were going to discover that leaving the barrels behind might have been the worst decision they made. By the time the maple syrup began disappearing from the warehouse, the people outside had no reason to think they were looking at the beginning of a major criminal investigation. St. Louis de Blanford was not a place where people expected to see a fortune disappear. It was a quiet community in Quebec, surrounded by the kind of landscape where agriculture and industry existed side by side without attracting much attention. Roads carried farm equipment, commercial vehicles, delivery trucks, and ordinary traffic. Warehouses stood among fields and rural properties. People knew the rhythms of the area. Morning, work, deliveries, evening, then darkness. Nothing about the landscape suggested that one of the most valuable stockpiles of maple syrup in the country was sitting inside a relatively ordinary building. That was the paradox at the heart of the crime. The wealth was enormous. The setting was not. Inside the warehouse were thousands of barrels filled with maple syrup. Outside were roads where trucks could move without looking unusual. The thieves did not need a dramatic escape route. They needed a route that looked normal. And Quebec had plenty of those. To understand why the warehouse existed in the first place, it is necessary to understand the unusual economics of maple syrup. Maple syrup production is tied to the seasons in a way that few modern commodities are. The producers cannot simply turn a machine on whenever the market demands more product. The sap comes when the weather permits it. A few degrees can make a difference. A winter that stays cold too long can delay the season. A sudden warm period can accelerate it. A strong freeze can change the flow. A short harvest season can reduce production. A long, favorable season can produce far more syrup than the market immediately needs. The industry therefore has to think beyond one season. The syrup produced today may not be sold tomorrow. Some of it may need to wait. That is where strategic reserves become important. The Fédération de Producteurs de Céréales du Québec had created a system in which surplus syrup could be stored and released later. To a consumer, the idea might seem unnecessary. Why not simply sell everything that is produced? Because an agricultural market can become unstable when supply changes sharply. If a massive harvest enters the market at once, prices can fall. If production collapses in a poor season, prices can rise sharply, and buyers may struggle to find enough product. A reserve can soften those fluctuations. It can protect producers. It can provide continuity for buyers. It can make an unpredictable agricultural commodity more predictable. But every reserve has a vulnerability. The more valuable the reserve becomes, the more important its security becomes. And by 2011, the reserve represented a tremendous amount of wealth. An exceptionally productive harvest had added huge quantities of syrup to the system. The result was a stockpile worth millions. That stockpile needed somewhere to go. It needed barrels. It needed storage. It needed a facility large enough to hold the product. And that facility became the warehouse at St. Louis de Blanford. The building was not designed to impress. It did not need to. A warehouse is judged by function. Does it keep the product dry? Can trucks access it? Can workers move goods efficiently? Can barrels be stored safely? Can inventory be managed? Those are the questions that matter. Security can become secondary, especially when the commodity inside does not immediately appear valuable. There is a psychological difference between a warehouse full of maple syrup and a warehouse full of gold. Gold announces its value. Maple syrup hides it. A stack of gold bars looks expensive. A stack of metal barrels looks industrial. That visual difference can affect how people think about security, and the thieves appear to have understood that. The warehouse became a place where ordinary industrial activity could hide extraordinary criminal activity. Trucks could arrive. Workers could move around. Barrels could be handled. And unless someone had a reason to ask why, none of those activities necessarily appeared suspicious. The absence of constant surveillance created another opening. The warehouse did not have a sophisticated network of cameras watching every movement. There was no high-tech system recording the position of every barrel in real time. The inventory was checked periodically. That meant there was a gap between what happened and when anyone verified what had happened. A thief can do a lot inside a gap. The longer the gap, the greater the opportunity. The criminals apparently recognized that. They did not need to empty the warehouse in a single operation. They could remove syrup gradually. They could replace it with water. They could leave the barrels where they belonged. Then they could return later. The method had another advantage. It reduced the psychological risk. If someone removes 1 barrel, the warehouse does not suddenly look empty. If someone removes 10 barrels, the difference might still be difficult to notice in a facility containing thousands. If someone removes hundreds over time, the disappearance is spread across the entire inventory. The eye sees rows of barrels. The records show thousands of barrels. The illusion survives. That is why the theft was so audacious. It depended on scale, working in the criminal's favor. The warehouse contained so much that the missing portion could hide inside the hole. The reserve was large enough to conceal its own losses. And the criminals had one more advantage. They understood that maple syrup is a liquid. Once removed from its original container, it could be transferred. That matters enormously in an investigation. A stolen object retains its identity. A stolen commodity can be transformed. Imagine stealing 1,000 individually numbered computers. Each one can be tracked. Now, imagine stealing thousands of liters of liquid. The liquid can be poured into new containers. The original barrels can remain behind. The product changes physical context. The evidence becomes harder to recognize. The criminals were not just stealing syrup. They were breaking the connection between the syrup and the warehouse. That connection was what investigators would later have to rebuild. But during the theft itself, the criminals had another task. They needed somewhere to put the syrup. This is where the operation moved from theft to logistics. A person can steal a product, but a person cannot sell millions of pounds of product without somewhere to take it. The syrup had to be transported. The trucks had to be loaded. The drivers had to know where to go. The product had to be stored. And eventually, it had to be sold. That required relationships. It required people who understood the industry. It required buyers who could absorb quantities larger than anything an ordinary consumer would ever purchase. The criminals needed a market that would not ask too many questions. Or perhaps more accurately, they needed a market where the questions could be answered convincingly. A shipment of maple syrup is not inherently suspicious. A large shipment is not inherently suspicious either. Companies buy large quantities. Processors buy large quantities. Wholesalers buy large quantities. The same product can move through many hands before reaching the consumer. That made the legitimate market the perfect disguise. The stolen syrup could enter the legal economy without looking different. The syrup did not have a criminal appearance. Its origin was the problem, and origins can be concealed. A buyer might ask where the syrup came from. A seller could provide an answer. Documents could be produced. A price could be agreed upon. A truck could arrive. The transaction could be completed. Once the money changed hands, the syrup became someone else's problem. That is how criminal supply chains often work. The original theft is only the first step. The real challenge is monetization. How do you turn stolen property into spendable money? In this case, the answer was remarkably efficient. Sell the syrup. The industry already existed. The customers already existed. The demand already existed. The criminals did not need to invent a new product. They had simply acquired a product for free. That made the potential profit enormous. The risk was also enormous. But risk can be difficult to perceive when a plan works repeatedly. The first successful theft changes the way people think. Before the first theft, the risk is theoretical. After the first theft, the criminals have evidence that the system can be exploited. That can create confidence. Confidence can lead to larger thefts. Larger thefts require more people. More people create more risk. But by then, the operation can have its own momentum. The people involved may already be making money. They may have invested time and resources. They may have developed relationships. They may have become dependent on the income. Stopping becomes harder. The theft becomes an operation rather than an event. That appears to be what happened with the maple syrup scheme. It was not one dramatic night. It was a process. A series of movements. A repeated pattern. The syrup disappeared. The barrels were refilled. The trucks moved. The product was sold. Then it happened again. And again. The operation lasted long enough that people outside the core group began noticing unusual activity. One of them was Raymond Pepin. Pepin lived near the area and noticed trucks associated with the warehouse. The traffic appeared unusual. Vehicles were moving at hours when a person might not expect significant warehouse activity. Late at night, early in the morning, weekends. None of those details alone proved anything. That is important. A truck at midnight is not evidence of a crime. A warehouse operating on a weekend is not evidence of a crime. A delivery outside normal hours can have an entirely legitimate explanation. But when the pattern continues, the ordinary explanation becomes less satisfying. Something was happening. Pepin could not know exactly what. He did not know that millions of dollars worth of syrup were being stolen. He did not know that the barrels were being emptied. He did not know who was involved. But he saw movement. That movement would later become part of the story. The trucks were one of the few visible signs of a crime designed to remain invisible. And that is another contradiction. The thieves were careful inside the warehouse. But the product had to leave. There was no way around that. The more syrup they stole, the more transportation they required. Every increase in the scale of the theft increased the number of opportunities for someone to notice. The criminals were balancing two competing needs. They needed to steal enough to make the operation worthwhile, but they needed to move slowly enough to avoid detection. They had to find the point between greed and caution. For months, they found it. The warehouse continued to appear normal. The trucks continued to move. The syrup continued to be sold. And the reserve continued to exist on paper. The longer this continued, the more impressive the deception became. But there was another weakness. Inventory. Inventory is a form of memory. It tells an organization what it owns. If the inventory is accurate, management knows what is physically present. If it is wrong, the organization is effectively blind. The thieves had created a discrepancy between physical inventory and recorded inventory. The longer that discrepancy remained undetected, the more syrup could disappear. The criminals were essentially borrowing time from the inventory system. They knew that eventually someone would check, but they were betting that the check would come after they had already made their money. It was a dangerous bet. It worked for a while. Then the system caught up with them. The summer of 2012 brought the inventory inspection that would expose everything. But before that moment, there was another important element. The people who had organized the theft needed to know what they were doing. This was not an industry where an outsider could simply walk into a warehouse, steal millions of dollars of syrup, and then magically find a buyer. The maple syrup business had its own networks, its own terminology, its own prices, its own relationships, its own expectations. Someone who did not understand those things would have difficulty moving the stolen product. That is why people with knowledge of the industry became so important. And that is where Richard Valliers entered the story. Valliers understood maple syrup. He understood the market. He knew buyers. He understood that the stolen product could be sold. According to later court proceedings, Valliers was involved in planning and marketing the stolen syrup. He would eventually become the most prominent figure associated with the case. But at this point, his name was only one part of a much larger story. The physical theft involved other people. The transportation involved other people. The storage involved other people. The selling involved other people. The investigation would eventually reveal the extent to which the crime depended on cooperation. That cooperation created strength. It also created weakness. Every person involved knew something. Every person involved had a story. And when police began asking questions, those stories would not necessarily match. Criminal networks are built on secrecy. But secrecy becomes difficult when dozens of people are connected. Someone always knows something. Someone remembers a truck. Someone remembers a phone call. Someone remembers a payment. Someone remembers a warehouse. Someone remembers a name. The police did not need everyone to confess. They only needed enough fragments to reconstruct the chain. The first fragments were beginning to appear. The warehouse, the trucks, the barrels, the water, the syrup, the buyers, and then the money. The theft was becoming a map. At one end was St. Louis to Blandford. At the other end were markets far beyond Quebec. Between them were the people who had transformed a strategic reserve into a source of illegal profit. But the investigation had not yet reached its most important stage. First came the realization that the warehouse itself had been vulnerable. The security system was not designed for a theft of this scale. There was no constant visual record. There was no immediate alarm when syrup was removed. The inventory was checked periodically, and the physical appearance of the warehouse could be maintained even after the contents had been stolen. It was a perfect storm of vulnerabilities. The criminals had not discovered a single flaw. They had discovered a combination: weak surveillance, periodic inventory, high-value commodity, large quantities, a functioning transportation network, a willing or unwitting market, and enough time. Together, those elements turned an ordinary storage facility into an extraordinary target. The tragedy for the Federation was that the very system designed to stabilize the maple syrup industry had created a concentrated pool of wealth. Concentration creates efficiency, but concentration also creates opportunity. If millions of dollars are spread across thousands of farms, stealing them becomes nearly impossible. If millions of dollars are gathered into one warehouse, the problem changes. The warehouse becomes a target. The strategic reserve was designed to protect the industry from market instability. Instead, for a time, it became vulnerable to criminal exploitation. That irony would later become impossible to ignore. The theft also exposed something uncomfortable about security. Security is often strongest against the threat people expect. A bank expects someone to steal money. An airport expects someone to bring dangerous objects. A jewelry store expects someone to target valuables. But a maple syrup warehouse? The threat may not have been imagined at the same level. The product seemed too ordinary. The theft seemed too strange. That perception could create complacency. And complacency can be dangerous. The criminals did not have to overpower the system. They simply had to wait for the system to assume everything was normal. For months, everything appeared normal, until it wasn't. When the first barrels were found to contain water, the scale of the problem began to emerge. The investigators could not initially see all 6 million pounds. They had to calculate, count, measure, compare. The number grew. Thousands of barrels, millions of pounds, millions of dollars. The warehouse was not missing a shipment. It had been systematically exploited. And now, the people who had done it were somewhere outside the building. They were no longer standing among the barrels. They were driving on roads, meeting buyers, moving money, living ordinary lives. That was the real challenge. The crime scene was stationary. The criminals were not. The warehouse could be secured. The barrels could be examined. But the people responsible could move. They could change vehicles, change addresses, change stories, move the syrup, move the money. They could attempt to erase the trail. Investigators had to move faster. They needed to identify the network before it disappeared. And the first major opportunity came when the stolen syrup surfaced outside Quebec. The discovery in New Brunswick would give investigators their first substantial piece of the missing commodity, a shipment worth roughly $1.6 million. It was no longer a theory. The syrup was out there. The theft had a physical footprint, and that footprint led away from the warehouse. Every recovered barrel could answer a question. Who sold it? Who bought it? Who transported it? Where was it stored? How was it paid for? The investigation was turning into a reverse journey. Instead of following the syrup from the forest to the consumer, police were following it from the buyer back toward the warehouse. And every step backward brought them closer to the people who had started the operation. The strange thing about maple syrup is that it carries the smell of its origin. It begins in the forest. Sap flows from trees. The syrup is boiled. It is filtered. It is stored. It is sold. The final product may travel thousands of kilometers, but the chain begins with a tree. The stolen syrup followed a different journey. It began in a reserve. It left through a warehouse. It entered trucks. It passed through hands. It crossed borders. And eventually, it began to reveal the people who had taken it. The investigators were following that trail, but the trail was still incomplete. There were missing pieces. Some barrels had been recovered. Others had disappeared into commerce. Some people knew more than they admitted. Others may have known nothing at all. The investigators would have to separate them. That process would take time. The case would involve arrests, charges, trials, appeals, and eventually the Supreme Court of Canada. But none of that could happen until the investigators answered the most basic question: who had turned a warehouse of maple syrup into a criminal enterprise? The answer would emerge piece by piece. And when it did, the story would reveal that the greatest theft in Canadian maple syrup history had not been built around violence. It had been built around confidence. Confidence that nobody would look closely. Confidence that a barrel would be mistaken for its contents. Confidence that a truck would look like every other truck. Confidence that a buyer would see syrup and not ask where it came from. Confidence that millions of dollars could disappear without anyone understanding how. For almost a year, that confidence was justified. Then someone checked the weight, and everything changed. The first thing the investigators had to understand was that the warehouse had never been intended to be a fortress. It was a storage facility. That distinction sounds small, but in a case involving millions of dollars, it becomes enormous. A fortress is designed around the possibility of attack. Every entrance is watched. Every movement is recorded. Every irregularity is treated as a potential threat. A warehouse is designed around movement. Goods arrive. Goods are unloaded. Workers move through aisles. Vehicles come and go. Containers are opened. Containers are closed. Paperwork is signed. Inventories are updated. And then everyone goes home. The system depends on routine. The system depends on people doing what they're supposed to do. And most of the time, that is enough. The problem begins when someone learns how to use the routine against itself. At St. Louis de Blandford, the thieves did not have to defeat an elaborate electronic security system. They did not have to bypass a wall of cameras. They did not need sophisticated computer equipment. They needed access. They needed knowledge. And they needed time. The warehouse reportedly lacked the kind of surveillance and alarm systems that would have made continuous unauthorized activity immediately obvious. There were no cameras watching every barrel. There was no constant electronic record showing when a particular container was moved. Instead, much of the security depended on physical controls and periodic inventory. That meant the warehouse could be secure at one moment and vulnerable over a longer period. The difference was time. A locked door can stop a thief tonight. It cannot tell you what happened 6 months ago. An inventory can tell you what should be there. It cannot necessarily tell you who removed something between 2 inspections. That gap was where the theft lived, and the criminals appear to have understood it. They did not attack the warehouse as if they were robbing a bank. They treated it as if they were manipulating a business process. The goal was not simply to remove syrup. The goal was to make the removal difficult to notice. That meant the barrels themselves became part of the deception. The thieves could take syrup from a barrel and leave the barrel behind. That was critical. If an entire barrel disappeared, the visual gap might eventually be obvious. But if the barrel remained in place, the warehouse continued to look full. A row of barrels does not reveal its weight. From several meters away, there is almost nothing to distinguish a barrel filled with syrup from a barrel filled with water. Both are metal. Both occupy the same amount of space. Both can sit quietly among hundreds of others. The difference is hidden inside, and that meant the thieves had discovered something incredibly simple. They did not need to hide the container. They only needed to hide the contents. The more you think about that strategy, the more unsettling it becomes. Imagine walking into the warehouse before the theft was discovered. Rows of barrels stretch into the distance. Everything appears normal. There is no smashed lock, no overturned container, no blood, no sign of violence, nothing that tells you a crime has occurred. If you were asked how much syrup was in the building, you would look at the inventory. You would count barrels. You would trust the records. You would assume the containers held what they were supposed to hold. But inside some of them, the syrup was already gone. The physical appearance of the warehouse had become a lie. And because the lie was physical, it was difficult to challenge without opening the system up and checking. That is why the eventual inventory was so devastating. Michel Gavreau did not walk into a warehouse expecting to uncover an $18 million theft. He was performing a task that was part of the normal operation. Inventory. Check the stock. Verify the contents. Compare the physical reality with the records. But ordinary work can sometimes uncover extraordinary crimes. The first unusual barrel would have been easy to dismiss. A discrepancy. A mistake. Perhaps a container had been damaged. Perhaps there had been a recording error. Perhaps someone had transferred syrup elsewhere. There are many innocent explanations for one anomaly. The danger begins when the anomalies repeat. Another barrel, then another. The pattern grows. The explanation becomes harder to maintain. The warehouse begins to change in the eyes of the person inspecting it. What had looked like a collection of ordinary containers now becomes a series of questions. Why is this one light? Why is that one light? Why is there water inside? Why does the inventory say syrup? How many are like this? And where did the syrup go? At some point, the investigation stops being about an inventory discrepancy. It becomes a crime scene. The moment that realization arrived, the numbers began to take on a different meaning. 6 million pounds. That number is difficult to imagine because most people have no practical reference for it. 6 million pounds is not a truckload. It is not even a few truckloads. It is a logistical problem. It requires repeated transportation. It requires loading equipment. It requires storage. It requires buyers. It requires coordination. And above all, it requires time. That meant the theft could not have been a spontaneous act. Somebody had planned it. Somebody had known where the syrup was. Somebody had understood its value. Somebody had known how to remove it without immediately triggering suspicion. And somebody had known where to sell it. The investigation, therefore, began with a disturbing possibility. The criminals had not simply discovered an opportunity. They had understood the system. That raised another question. Were they insiders? Did they have direct access? Did they know when inventory would take place? Did they know how the syrup was stored? Did they know how much could be moved at a time? Or were they working with people who did? The answers matter because access is one of the most valuable forms of information in organized theft. You can have a truck. You can have buyers. You can have money. But if you cannot get to the product, none of it matters. The warehouse was the gate. Someone had to know how to open it. The investigators began looking at everyone connected to the facility and the industry. Workers. Drivers. Buyers. Middlemen. Storage operators. People who had handled the syrup. People who knew the reserve. People who understood the market. The list was long. And the more investigators learned about the industry, the more they realized why this particular commodity was so attractive. Maple syrup has an unusual combination of characteristics. It is valuable. It is easy to recognize. It is widely traded. It is relatively durable. And most importantly, legitimate demand already exists. A criminal stealing an unusual object faces a difficult question. Who would buy it? A criminal stealing maple syrup has a much easier answer. The people who already buy maple syrup. That is what made the theft so different from a traditional burglary. The thieves did not have to find a secret market. They could exploit the existing one. They simply had to conceal the source, and the source could become harder to trace as the syrup moved from one hand to another. The first buyer might know the seller. The second buyer might know only the first buyer. The third might know only the second. At the end of the chain, someone could be holding legitimate-looking maple syrup with no obvious reason to suspect its history. The criminality was upstream. The product itself was innocent. That distinction would later become important in the investigation. Not everyone who handled the syrup was necessarily part of the conspiracy. Some may have known exactly what they were buying. Some may have suspected. Some may have known nothing. Investigators had to determine the difference. That is where the case became more than a simple theft investigation. It became an investigation into a network. And networks leave patterns. A single transaction can be explained away. A series of transactions begins to tell a story. A truck that travels to one warehouse may be ordinary. A truck that repeatedly travels between the same locations at unusual times becomes interesting. A large purchase can be legitimate. Several large purchases from the same source can raise questions. A price can be attractive. An unusually attractive price can become suspicious. The investigators were looking for patterns like these, and they had an enormous advantage. The syrup had to move. No matter how carefully the criminals planned the theft, they could not make 6 million pounds disappear into thin air. It had to go somewhere. That meant roads, warehouses, border crossings, businesses, transactions, people. The stolen syrup was leaving fingerprints of a different kind. Not biological fingerprints, commercial fingerprints, a paper trail, a transportation trail, a financial trail, a human trail. The first major traces began to appear outside Quebec. New Brunswick became important. Then the United States. The syrup was traveling farther than the original thieves might have expected. That created distance between the crime scene and the commodity. But distance can work both ways. It makes an investigation harder. It also creates more jurisdictions. More jurisdictions mean more records, more agencies, more witnesses, more opportunities for someone to notice that something does not add up. On September 25, 2012, investigators searched a facility associated with Etienne Saint-Pierre in Kedgwick, New Brunswick. What they found changed the investigation. There was maple syrup. A lot of it. The estimated value was around 1.6 million Canadian dollars. For investigators who had started with a warehouse full of suspicious barrels, the discovery was significant. The missing syrup was not simply gone. It was somewhere. And now they had found part of it. The question became even more important. Who had brought it there? The investigation began moving backward. The syrup became a witness. It could not speak, but it had a history. It had come from somewhere. Someone had transported it. Someone had sold it. Someone had purchased it. Someone had stored it. The investigators needed to reconstruct each step. That meant interviews. Hundreds of them. People in the maple syrup industry were questioned. Some knew about the theft. Some knew nothing. Some may have heard rumors. Some may have seen unusual activity. Others may have been involved directly. The police were searching for connections, and the connections were beginning to form a web. One name appeared repeatedly: Richard Vallières. He was not simply someone who had accidentally received stolen syrup. He had knowledge of the maple syrup market. He understood the value of the product. And according to the evidence later presented in court, he became a central figure in the commercialization of the stolen syrup. The importance of Vallières was not merely that he was connected to stolen goods. It was that he represented the bridge between the theft and the marketplace. That bridge was essential. Without it, the stolen syrup would have been difficult to monetize. Imagine stealing a warehouse full of maple syrup and having nowhere to sell it. You would possess a fortune that could not easily be converted into cash. The product would become a burden. You would need storage. You would need transportation. You would need customers. You would need explanations. The more you stole, the harder the problem became. But someone who already understands the market can solve those problems. That person knows who buys, knows who transports, knows what prices look normal, knows how much can be moved without attracting attention, knows which relationships matter. Knowledge transforms stolen property into money. And that is why the investigation increasingly focused on the people who understood the market. The warehouse was only the source. The real criminal infrastructure existed beyond its walls. The further investigators followed the syrup, the more the case began to resemble a business operation. There was procurement, there was logistics, there was distribution, there was sales, there was revenue. The only difference was that the original inventory had not been purchased. It had been stolen. That distinction was hidden from many of the people who later encountered the product. The criminals were effectively trying to wash the syrup through commerce. They did not need to make the syrup look different. They needed to make the transaction look legitimate. That was a much easier problem. And the more legitimate transactions surrounded the stolen syrup, the harder it became to isolate. A legitimate buyer might purchase a shipment. A processor might combine it with other syrup. A distributor might move the product again. At each stage, the original crime became less visible. The product moved farther away from the warehouse. The money moved in the opposite direction. That created two trails: the physical trail of syrup and the financial trail of money. Investigators could follow either. Sometimes the two trails would meet. That was where the strongest evidence could emerge. But following money is not always straightforward. Cash can disappear. Payments can be disguised. Transactions can be made through intermediaries. People can claim they were paid for legitimate services. That meant investigators needed more than a single suspicious transaction. They needed a pattern. And patterns take time to build. The investigation continued. The number of people questioned grew. The number of locations expanded. The stolen syrup surfaced in new places. And slowly, the image of the operation became clearer. It was not one man with a truck. It was not a random group of opportunists. It was a network. Different people could play different roles. Some had access. Some had transportation. Some had storage. Some had buyers. Some had knowledge. And some had the ability to turn stolen syrup into cash. The operation worked because each person only needed to perform part of the job. That is one of the defining characteristics of organized crime. No single participant necessarily needs to control everything. The system distributes responsibility. One person can tell another where the product is. Another can arrange transportation. Another can receive it. Another can sell it. Another can collect money. The more fragmented the operation becomes, the more difficult it can be to understand from the outside. But fragmentation also creates vulnerability. People make mistakes. People talk. People keep records. People remember. And people eventually get caught. The first recovered syrup was already one of those mistakes. The criminals had moved a massive quantity of product through a chain of transactions. The chain had survived for months, but eventually one link had become visible. Once police found that link, they could begin pulling. And when investigators pull one thread from a network, other threads often move with it. Names emerge. Locations emerge. Phone records become relevant. Financial transactions become relevant. Vehicles become relevant. The question changes from who stole the syrup to who knew. That is a much harder question. Knowledge is invisible. A person can stand beside stolen property and claim ignorance. Sometimes that claim is true. Sometimes it is not. Investigators have to look at circumstances, price, quantity, relationships, timing, behavior, and patterns. If someone buys a small amount of syrup at a normal price, there may be nothing suspicious. If someone suddenly receives enormous quantities through unusual channels at unusually favorable prices, Investigators may ask why. The same transaction can look innocent in isolation and suspicious when placed in